began to suffer. Everything began to suffer because he started to drink very heavily. He was definitely under spiritual attack. Never admitted that to anyone except for my mom's mom. And he did confide in her and said that, he was seeing apparitions and manifestations. And so there's no doubt that he was under spiritual attack.
Right.
And so this was a man's man, very rugged individual, and he was used to being in control of every situation. And I'm sure that it greatly affected him emotionally to suddenly be faced with a situation that he couldn't control. And so I believe this drove him and greatly contributed to him, looking for an escape. And unfortunately, that escape was in heavy alcohol consumption. And then he just began to be maniacal, and turned into a raging alcoholic who began to physically abuse my mother on a regular basis, nearly killing her on several occasions. And, I can recall being 8 years old, having to run to a neighbor's house to get the police called on my dad because he was killing my mother.
Yeah.
And I have no doubt, based on what I witnessed, that these demonic forces were able to actually enter him and fuel his rage while under the influence of alcohol. So he left us in 1975. Thank God he did. But he left us in such a horrible way. What I failed to mention here is my mom was very ill the entire time we lived in the house.
Right.
She had high blood pressure, which led to strokes, which ultimately led to kidney failure, and she couldn't work. And so after he left, he wasn't sending any money home, and he'd gone to Florida. And we ended up losing the house. The house was auctioned off in the front yard. And the man that bought the house in the public auction was aware of my mother's situation and circumstances and allowed us to stay there on a pay-as-you-can, when-you-can basis. So that's why we stayed. My grandmother, my mother's mother, wanted us to come stay with her, but she and my step-grandfather shared a one-bedroom apartment. My mother was not going to burden them. And my mom's sister wanted us to come stay with her, but she had 8 children and a husband. And, again, my mom was not going to be a burden to anybody. And, as time went on, each and every one of us came under various forms of demonic oppression while living there because we all did things that were way out of character.
Right, exactly.
So it was really hellish the entire time. And it had gotten so bad that after my dad had left in 1975, my mother came under regular physical attack from these entities, which continued up until the time of her untimely death, which was shortly after leaving the house. And it was awful. She couldn't sleep in her bed anymore. She actually had my brother and I. The way this house was laid out, the house sits at the bottom of a downhill cul-de-sac with a large and deep ravine behind it. You would enter in through the front door into the living room. The house was very dark on the inside, dark brown paneling, almost black. Very little light came into that house. And so you would come through the living room, you'd make a right down a long hallway, and that's where the bedrooms and the bathroom was. And my brother and I shared the first room on the right, and my parents' room was the second on the right. My sister's room was across the hallway, last room on the left. And that room, I believe, was the portal or entryway or whatever you want to call it, because that room remained cold. Even on the warmest of summer days, that room was cold, and that's also the room where the door would open and slam for many repetitions at a time.
The whole situation, and what I keep thinking, there's 2 things I always think about when I hear this, is that no matter how much your parents tried to protect you, the less they could protect you. Because it seemed that when, especially your mother, because your dad was kind of in denial for a while, and, he was the man's man, like you said, and so he just couldn't understand the whole thing that was going on and didn't quite accept it. But your mother got it. And the more she tried to protect you guys, the more she was attacked.
Absolutely.
And for you guys to be able, and I don't think people realize too that this didn't happen over a short period of time. This was quite an extensive period of time, wasn't it?
Yeah, over 10 years. We left there in December of 1980, so we lived there for over 10 years. And it wasn't until I really sat down and revisited the whole thing, when I sat down to write Dark Force, and I had to relive those events as I was writing the book, and that's where it really hit me, the magnitude of everything, and just thinking, how in the world did we endure that for so long?
Yeah.
And, I say it was like we were prisoners in a POW camp. We were just, after a while, we were very much zombie-like. We were robbed of our emotions, and even towards each other, we'd become cold. It was just, we were surviving on a daily basis. It was very, very cold. There was no joy. The only joy that I can recall in the entire childhood was my participation in sports. I was an athlete, and that certainly was my outlet, away from everything.
Mm-hmm.
And, I got my brother involved in sports as well, and so that was the joy. I was always the first kid on the field and always the last kid off, because I did not want to go home. I always dreaded home, so I always wanted the game to continue.
Absolutely. Now, when you finally were able to escape, so to speak, that didn't mean that you were in the clear. You had to
Correct.
to really decompress and really disengage from the whole thing, and to try to put your sanity back. And not only you, but your whole family.
Because this continued, into my adult years. And, had many, if I were to list all the paranormal, supernatural experiences, I've had in my life, we would have a series of shows. And this did continue into my adult years, and continued in many different forms and ways, including exposure to many UFO experiences and sightings as well. In my case, it's all tied together. A lot of people would say, oh, they're separate things. Well, not in my case. They're absolutely tied together. Absolutely. And there are just so many different facets of this that came together, so many different types of experiences, and it continued into my adult years. And I got to a point, really, to where, as I was getting into my adulthood, and I was always a mature and serious kid, and had to be because of the situation. And so I had to grow up very, very fast. And I quit school in the 8th grade, after my mom had suddenly died. And it wasn't long after moving out of the house that those tragedies occurred with my mother and grandmother. My grandmother suddenly died from a series of heart attacks, and then 2 months, 2 days later, my mom had died from a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 44. And I have no doubt that, those demonic entities and the experiences that we were having, greatly contributed to those deaths, because we were all under so much stress,
absolutely,
constant stress, lack of sleep, and just pressure all the time. So I have no doubt it contributed, to their early demise. And so suddenly, after they had passed, those were the two closest people to me in my life, and I just didn't care anymore. I didn't care whether I lived or died. I really was looking. I was seeking death. I was searching for death. It was not suicidal, but I was doing things to bring death on. I was really living on the edge, and I've been in many life-threatening situations, and yet God spared my life because he had a plan for me, and I believe he had a plan for me from the very beginning, and that plan is unfolding now. So I understand it now. Couldn't understand it then. Totally understand it now. But it took all those years, to go through all of these things, and in a strange way, Zita, I could not be where I'm at now had I not been there.
Because you would never be able to understand it.
Exactly.
What I love about you is, for many, many years, even before I started with radio, I always talked about the paranormal and spirituality, and the paranormal and that narrow line between the two, and there really isn't a division between the two. They really are so closely related, because you can look at the dark side, so to speak, to what you're going through or what you went through as a child. But there's also a beautiful side to it, because it taught you to be the man that you are now.
Absolutely correct. So God had that plan from the very beginning. And I think really this was about Satan trying to stop that before it got to where it's at right now, where God is working through me to help many, many people to come out of this kind of garbage. So I have a full understanding of why that all took place and why I'm at, and where I'm at, and the reason why I'm here at this very moment. And, my life is very, very blessed now. Each and every day is a blessing. I can never thank God and praise Him enough for what He has done, for what He's doing, and for what He's going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's go ahead and take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about how you got to be where you are now, and because it's really a beautiful story. Because this is where I watched you transition into that gray side, I'm going to say, because it's not really a dark side anymore, that gray side into realizing what your true mission is. So don't go away. You're listening to The Broader View on the Hazy Radio Network. We'll be right back.